So we've had AI literacy, digital literacy, climate literacy, data literacy, information literacy today. And so I'm the last literacy, futures literacy. What's all that about? So, well, I hope, or my aim, my learning goal is that by the end of this hour, you understand futures literacy better than you do now. And also, by the end of this hour, you will have in your hands 4 versions of the future that you will have created, starting in about 30 minutes and finishing at the end of the session, and even if you're online. So, oops. No, okay, old-fashioned. Yeah. Okay. Right. So, this is a kind of, so the first bit I'm going to talk for a bit. Sorry, but I think it will help you understand the second bit better. This is a story in 4 parts. The first bit is how in 2023, I and a team of my colleagues was asked to write a report about the future of public libraries by CILIP in the UK. The second bit of the story, the second bit of the story is that when we started writing that, we started to think, actually, there are some really good reports about the future of libraries, public libraries, academic libraries, specialist libraries. There are lots of reports about the future of libraries. But we started to doubt whether the audiences that they are written for know what to do with them. So that took us to futures literacy, enabling, I mean, in really, really simple terms, written language or written books are no use unless people have the basic literacy to read them. Data is of limited use unless people have the data literacy to know what to do with it. AI, again, as we've discussed. And then fourthly, futures literacy doesn't end in the library and information sphere, that actually this is something which we believe adds a huge amount of value if you can build futures literacy within library and information professions to then build futures literacy amongst the communities that you work with. So for public libraries, that's the local community. For academic libraries, that's your students. So that's my story in 4 parts. Okay, so very quickly, in 2023, we wrote a report. We wrote a report about the future of public libraries, and we wrote it for CILIP, the Library Association in the UK, and we did that because libraries face lots and lots of fundamental challenges like these, long-term, especially for public libraries in the UK, huge cost pressures, declining use, major societal shifts, and all this is. So there was, it wasn't really an unusual request. And to create that report, and there's a QR code, and you can read it at the end. We did all the usual things that you'll see in futures reports, whether it's the future of libraries or the future of farming or the future of transport or the future of the oceans or the future of whatever you want, future of food, future of education. You'll see trend scanning, identifying uncertainties, creating scenarios, using those uncertainties, people talking in workshops about it to kind of try and make sense of it all, and then testing ideas and possible approaches against different possible futures. And I think we came up with some read-worthy conclusions. The headline was that for public libraries, our argument is that public libraries perform a unique role, or in the future can perform a unique role around digital access and social connection, not separately, but at the same time. So not people using technology, accessing the internet, accessing digital information kind of in a booth on their own, and then around the corner, someone going to a rhyme time or a loneliness, kind of group, but actually digital access and social connection at the same time is kind of a unique thing that public libraries can do. And then we came up with a bunch of other things that we think libraries also need to do: reverse declining use, focus on leadership, deal with the impending retirement cliff edge, and so on. It was quite a good report, But we had this nagging feeling in the back of our mind that there are lots of really good reports about libraries, and people don't know what to do with them. And people are still saying, we need to look at the future of libraries, we need to work out what to do. And we thought, well, if some of those reports that have been effective with their audience, we wouldn't still be asking this question. And in fact, so, you know, has anyone read any of these? Anyone recognize any of them? Oh, we'll send out slides, read them. They're really good. They're all really good. And people always go, oh, these are so interesting. The bookend scenarios, and all the scenarios were named after, like one was called Fahrenheit 451. You know, they're great names. They really had fun with it. The American Research Libraries one, that was, you know, talked about a lot. This one, the third one in with the most boring cover, we wrote that one back in 2010. Anyway, so we sort of had this kind of crisis, this doubt. So we came to futures literacy, and we thought maybe one thing that's going on here, like you can have great data, you can have great written information, you can have great AI tools, but if you don't have the literacy to understand what to do with it, it's going to be of limited use. So we kind of pivoted, and we thought, right, well, that's a good report, but we're now having this kind of crisis of confidence about whether or not we were doing anything useful with it. So we thought, let's also focus on futures literacy. And CILIP also got kind of this got under their skin, this kind of doubt. And so what they did was they enabled us, they paid us, they funded us to produce a futures literacy toolkit. And what I'm going to go through with you today is some of what's in there. And then you can then use the futures literacy toolkit yourselves, because there's a QR code, you can download it and you can use it yourselves. And then maybe that might get you to think, well, maybe we can share this form of knowledge, this literacy, with our communities that we work with. So we are now into the realm of futures literacy. What does that mean? Who's come across the term futures literacy? But not via the agenda for today's workshop. Okay, all right, that's a kind of healthy 5%, I think. Right, okay, not bad. Okay, so here we go, futures literacy. If you think, I'm struggling with the angle here, but let's try this. If you think of all the different possible versions of the future that might happen right after this point in time, after this moment, if you think of all the versions of the future, every single possible timeline you can imagine, as a very, very big circle, even including things that you don't think are particularly likely, but they might be possible within the known laws of physics. Think of that as a big circle. Then think about the plausible futures, the ones which you think, oh yeah, that could happen. Think of that as a slightly smaller circle. And now think about the most probable, or what you consider the most likely futures. That's the smallest circle of this little three sets of circles. Also, we need to think about our preferable future, the future we wish for. Well, the future we wish for is a different category. So the future we wish for might be very likely. It might be not likely, but maybe believable or plausible. But the future we wish for might even be not possible, or at least not possible within the known laws of physics. I might, or human behavior, I might wish for a future in which in the next decade, all the leaders of the world decide to act as one on climate change. Now, in the known laws of human behavior, that might not really be possible, but I might still wish for it. And it doesn't matter how hard I wish, even if I wish very, very hard, I can't wish my preferred future into being. Maybe I can, but I'm not guaranteed to. And the amount of wishing doesn't necessarily determine whether or not I can make it happen or not. It does depend on who I am. So just as a sidebar, the People's Republic of China have, for about the past 40 years, made it one of their #1 political priority is to ensure that their preferred future becomes a reality. And that is the People's Republic of China's #1 political goal, to make our preferred future, which in 1980 seemed impossible, to turn an agricultural developing nation into one of, or possibly the, leading industrial nation of the world. It seemed impossible, but they decided that they wanted their preferred future, making that a reality, to be the number one political priority. They operate in a different framework of politics, but so it doesn't mean your preferred thing can't happen, but there's a big depends around it. Okay, so, and even if we're thinking about the most likely future isn't very likely. Well, it might be likely, but it might not be very likely. So if you think of a game that you play with 2 dice, Monopoly, Cluedo, lots of others. Okay, think of a game you play with 2 dice. The most likely result when you throw 2 dice, 2 6-sided dice, is, mathematicians. Yes, someone said it. 7. It is 7. It's mathematically the most likely. 6 and 1, 5 and 2, 4 and 3. There are more combinations. If you put them in a grid, more combinations come to 7 than anything else. So if I said, right, if I gave everybody a handful of gambling chips, or maybe some, I don't know, some Maltesers or something to gamble with, and I said, right, okay, we're going to play just a game of, I think it actually has a game. Is it craps, I think, with 2 dice? We're going to play a game of 2 dice, and you're just going to bet on the number. And I've just told you that 7 is the most likely number. And I've got, you know, a chart on the wall with all the possible numbers it can come to. And like, who wants to bet? Quite a lot of you are going to put all your chips or your Maltesers on 7. Most likely one. Do you know how likely it is to throw a 7 with 2 dice? There's a kind of mathematical beauty to this. It's 1 in 6. Or 16.666% recurring. So if now I said, well, actually, it's the most likely, but there's only a 1 in 6 chance, and maybe you get some better odds on some of the other ones, you might think, I'll take a chance. It doesn't seem so likely. So even the most likely, when we say most likely, we talk about likelihood, the most likely weather tomorrow, the most likely outcome of an election, the most likely winner of a competition, the most likely thing that might happen tomorrow. Even the most likely isn't always very likely. Right, let's take it up a notch. Here's something a bit more detailed about how we think about the future. It's from the work of someone called Bill Sharp, who is a brilliant sort of academic in the futures and scenarios world. And he also does, if you search for his latest podcast, it's fantastic. It's all about systems, and he wanders up and down mountains and talks about stone walls and systems, and it's all very, very wonderful and mind-stretching. But he gives us 4 ways to think about the future. And it's based around how much agency and control we have versus how much certainty or uncertainty there is in the context that we're operating in. So in this grid, there are lots of grids in futures work, but anyway, in this grid, in the top left, make sure I've got my around today. In the top left are organizations who are operating in a context with very low uncertainty, so not a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of control. And if this is the situation that you're working in, then you can, well, the world is relatively simple compared to many other people's. And so you can actually plan out a roadmap. You can say, we're going to do this, then this, then this. And the example that Bill Sharp gives is the mobile phone operators like Vodafone. And because they operate in a field, in a sector where there's it's a very small number of companies, there's very long lead-in times and a huge amount of regulation to develop new technology. So everything's quite predictable. You can see things coming. Nothing comes out of the blue. Nothing gets regulated. Nothing passes regulation suddenly. You can see it making its way through the digestive system of regulatory bodies. So you can actually plan out quite effectively. We're going to do 3G, 4G. We're going to do 5G in whenever it was, 2018. We're going to do 6G in 2030. We're going to do 7G in 2040. You can plan it out. But if you're in the bottom right, where you've got a lot of uncertainty and not so much control, then you can't set out a roadmap in the same way. But what you can do is test your plans against different versions of the future and see how resilient you are. That's like, see, you know, it's a bit like you might think, how good is what's in my suitcase for the weather that I might encounter on my holiday? That's why we call the report Come Rain or Shine. We can't really control the weather. If the whole planet got together and politicians got their act together on climate change, then maybe over a 50-year span you could control the weather. But I can't control the weather today in Dublin. So instead I have to prepare and think, is what I'm wearing going to be suitable for the kinds of weather I might face? And I didn't bring a waterproof, so the answer is no. So there we go. There's just another way to think about the future. So if you operate in a context where there's a lot of uncertainty and you don't have a lot of control, and I think many people working in individual libraries are probably like, maybe libraries around the world, if they work together, could have some kind of larger agency, but an individual library, whether it's a public library, academic library, or a specialist library, got limited agency in the world, got a lot of uncertainty. What you can do is test what you're doing, what you plan to do. Maybe test investments you're going to make, whether they're kind of capital investments in a new building or revenue investments in a training program or a new service. You can test them against different versions of the future and think, how well prepared are we for the futures we might face? And to do that, one way to do that is to create different scenarios, to get out of thinking that there's just going to be one thing that happens, to remind ourselves there's many, many different ways the world might play out. So to do that, we need to just have a quick moment to think about trends and uncertainties. So a trend, oh yes, here we go. A trend is a change in a general direction. If you can answer these questions about a factor, it's probably a trend. What is changing? Can you describe clearly what is changing? Can you say which direction it is going in? And can you point to some reliable evidence or data? So if we take the first one, the increasing use of portable devices for instant web access. Okay, I think that's a trend because we can describe what the factor is. It's quite nicely described. Most people would understand that. We can say which direction it's going in. Increasing, it's going up, the number's getting bigger. And we can point to some reliable data. There's all sorts of data for this one. There's data on the sales of portable devices. There's data you can get from the like just how much traffic you can look up. You know, how many people came to your website from a mobile device versus a laptop. And also we can see a lot of kind of qualitative evidence around us that more and more people are using portable devices to do quite complex things, like, you know, they might even be editing documents and sending it back, not just responding to emails. So definitely we can answer that. But that is definitely a trend. Sometimes you might hear someone describe something as a trend, and it might not be a trend yet, but and I think it's always good to unpack this. So sometimes we're having discussions, especially in kind of public sector kind of workshops, and someone will say, yes, here's a trend, let's write this one on the flip chart. Public-facing services are becoming more responsive to community need. And I say, is that a trend? It's definitely a trend. It's a really, really strong trend here in London Borough or wherever. It's a really strong trend. And I'll say, okay, so what data do you have to support that? Does your customer survey say that people believe you're becoming more responsive, that they trust you? And I said, well, not yet, but that's where we want to go. Okay, so let's scrub out trend and call that an ambition. Okay, not a trend yet, may not ever be a trend. And then also, then there's the other meaning of trends, meaning kind of, you know, my son is convinced he wants a low taper fade haircut because it's a trend. Okay. It's not a trend in this sense. Okay. Now on to uncertainties. Uncertainties are special things. They're not like trends. Trends are based on fact. Uncertainties are not. They're very, very they're about uncertainty. They're also far more subjective. So an uncertainty is something where we know what the factor is, but we know that it can go in different directions. So we know that it's uncertain. So we know, if we take trends, we know that population aging is happening. We know there's a trend. It might taper off tomorrow. It might flat out. Life expectancy is flattening out in the UK, but we know that there's a demonstrable trend and it's well evidenced. But with uncertainties, we know that we don't know which direction it's going in, or we can't be sure. So people's trust in technology, public trust in technology, we don't know. And I think there's a lot of good data that shows how uncertain that is. The speed of economic growth, we know just looking back that economic growth varies greatly kind of in cycles, but is also massively prone to shocks. So we don't know what direction they're going in. And I think uncertainties underpin the way that we can think about how the way the next 5, 10, 15 years plays out. It could go in many different directions. The trends, population aging, will probably continue at some rate. Adoption of technology will probably continue at some rate. Migration and urbanization will probably continue at some rate. There's some things that will continue, but there's also some things which we don't know. And that creates the basis of thinking about different versions of this future. So, everyone with us so far? Right. Volume okay on the online people? Okay, right. So, creating simple scenarios. And this is, so I'm going to describe it now, and then we're going to do it in the room. And we've got some tables and some flip charts. And I'm going to give out some templates based on some of the stuff that I've shown you, which comes from the CILIP toolkit, which you can download through a QR code at the end, and which people online have been sent a link. I think they've been sent PowerPoint, so you can just look at it. Okay, so how do we create scenarios? Now, I should say this is the most basic, bog standard way of creating scenarios. It's where we start in the toolkit because it's the easiest one to get to grips with very quickly. It's only kind of the beginnings. It's step one on creating ways to get people thinking about the future. And there's so many more interesting, engaging, creative, amazing, inspiring ways to think about the future than what I'm going to show you. But I think if I show you this, then you'll be interested in the other stuff. Okay, so the starting point for creating scenarios is to take two unrelated uncertainties. They've got to be unrelated because otherwise you end up in a bit of a feedback loop. So if you take two uncertainties like the speed of economic growth and the health of high streets and shopping districts, someone will say, oh, but I think the health of high streets is related to the speed of economic growth, and it's hard to imagine high streets thriving if economic growth is tanking. So they have to be unrelated, two separate things. Okay, so here are two unrelated uncertainties. Will public spending get tighter or looser? And will local government have more or less autonomy? And we've seen autonomy, certainly in the UK, we've seen autonomy of local government come and go. It's independent of public spending. So we've had times when there's been lots of public spending, but an incredibly controlling central government. We've had times when there's been efforts at devolving power, when there's lots of money around and then there's no money around, but they're two independent things. So you take two unrelated uncertainties, stick them into a grid, another grid. One on the horizontal, one on the vertical, or combinations. More public spending, but more public spending with less local government freedom, more public spending with more local government freedom on the bottom, less public spending, but you've got less public spending combined with less freedom and more freedom. So we've got four very different versions of the future. And if you think of other uncertainties, you could have even more kind of mind-stretching uncertainties and even more difference between the four corners. But you can then start to describe what these futures might be like. So taking the top row, more public spending. But if there's more public spending with less freedom for local government, and I guess in the UK, we might say that actually the early 2000s, the kind of 1997 Tony Blair Labour government, those who were students of British politics, there was a lot of money around, but it was very, very controlling indeed. And so local public services had more money, but they had reams and reams of reporting. They had so much control over what they could spend it on. It was almost as if They weren't running their own services. They were really just channeling public money from Westminster into their local communities. And there was even, you know, some of those programs had a big song and dance about how it's going to be community-led, but really they were just signing off. So you could have a version of more public spending, but with very, very little control. You could have a different version of public spending with a lot of local control. You might have like a devolved city government. You've got more money and more freedom how to do it, what to do with this. You might have a city government that does something very different from the next city. You might say, oh, this city is going to introduce a tourism tax. This city is going to invest in public transport. This city is going to spend nothing on public services whatsoever because they just want to keep taxes down. And it's going to be everyone for themselves. So you can have very different, you could have very different versions of the future by combining two uncertainties. And that's what we're going to do in a moment. Okay, is everyone following this so far? Okay, right. Well, I'm not following my script, so I'm completely lost now. We're carried away there. La la la, sketching out combinations, yeah. Oh yeah, you can give them cool names as well, because this is really about telling stories. We are not, underline the word not, we're not trying to predict the future. This is just combining two uncertainties. I could combine another two and another two, and we could do 4, 8, 32, 1028, any multiple of 4. We could have as many scenarios as we want, and we can just make them, throw them away, make them, throw them away, make them and throw them away. And each one is not a prediction of the future. They're tools to get people thinking about how the future is uncertain and how we have to start thinking or remind ourselves to think about the future as being many, many possible paths. Okay, so give them cool names and it helps people do that. You can put images by them as well. You could tell stories, you can make short films, you can make animations. You could even design kind of short dramatic works around them. You could do anything you want, but yet they have to be different. Now I've really lost myself now. So yeah, do lots, throw them away, do more, throw them away. Okay. However, you will find that there'll be some patterns. There is often, when you combine these, a scenario that seems a lot worse than today. A dystopian nightmare, double bad, terrible climate change and robots take over the world. Oh dear, Blade Runner, it's always raining and you discover your best mate's a robot. But he gives a great speech at the end about the I can't remember the speech anyway. You know the one. Anyway, right. A mix of better and worse, kind of unpredictable. Oh wow, some things I recognise, but some things are very different. And they're quite thought-provoking. A better than today, and I think this reveals our values. So often one end of the uncertainty with the thing we wish for. Governments get together and sort out climate change. Social inequality and injustice is reduced. Political instability flattens out. So you end up with the good, which is basically our values, all our dreams come true. And then sometimes the same as now. And it's just, another grey day. So, as I said, scenarios are stories, not triple underline, not predictions. And also the most likely future isn't. So here we go. And also, we are kind of creating stories about the future, but we also have to imagine the future is not, as William Gibson said. Any William Gibson readers in the audience? Yes. Which one? The famous one or the less famous but often rated higher one? Famous one. Neuromancer. Yes. No, the other one. Neuromancer?
Connect the works. I've found the 3 of them.
Yeah. No. So the less often mentioned but often thought of as better ones.
Oh, I thought you meant the stuff from the 90s.
Yeah. No, late 80s. Yeah. No, late 70s. Anyway, William Gibson, the author, the science fiction author, said the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. I think he was based in California when he was writing Neuromancer and other things. And he was in California, and so he could see kind of like the bubblings of tech and the kind of the tech wave that would overtake California. But he could also see kind of agricultural America still going strong, kind of almost like 1930s America, still going strong in California. The future is already here. It's not very evenly distributed. And I like this picture because it reminds me of what he meant by that. And so this picture here is, you can probably guess if you can read the Wikimedia kind of image credit. But anyone want to have a quick guess at what this is? Online participants, tap it in quick if you can.
CERN?
It's a really, really famous piece of engineering dangling on the thing in the middle. The lunar module. It's the lunar module. Correct. So it's the lunar module. The amazing thing is, I saw a picture the other day of the Artemis mission in the same human spaceflight production facility with the same very distinctive rails down the walls, and it looks exactly the same today, 60 years on. And I think that's amazing. But that kind of spoils the story, because what I was really trying to say is, so people would go to work here at Kennedy Space Center. These people would turn up to work and they would be kind of in the future. And then on their way home, they would stop in the shopping mall in a very, very different version of 1960s Florida. And the people here would probably not have any idea that this existed there, that the future was there amongst them. And the people here would have that culture shock of walking out and walking into this. So the future is not evenly distributed. Right. So now we're going to do this ourselves. Does everyone feel confident, or at least excited by the idea of just having a go at making a scenario cross with two uncertainties and creating their own 4 different versions of the future? There's a lot of help and some handouts, so I'm not just going to go off and do it. Right. Okay. Who feels ready for this?
Yes.
Okay. Online, do people feel ready? Come on, online people. Just one little thumbs up will give me the confidence to continue. Yes, okay, we can go. Right, okay. So we do need to break into groups, and we have approximately 30 people in the room. So I think 5 groups of 6. Online, don't all rush around because it's going to mess up the sound, but stay put for a second. So I think 5 groups of 6, you can form any group you want. You do need to find some pens and some flip chart. Actually, no, you could do it. No, don't worry about the flip chart paper. Just find groups of whatever I said, 5 or 6, and take one of these handouts of stuff stapled together. If you're online, you can do this on your own, but you will have this grid that I'm showing on screen now, with 2 suggested uncertainties. So these work. So you can do either restrictions on worker migration. Let's just restrictions. Uncertainty pair 1. Restrictions on worker migration get tighter or looser, and public trust in technology goes up or down. That's actually a really good one. Climate disruption is higher or lower, or gets worse, better or worse than it has been over the last decade, versus funding for cultural institutions go up or down. That's also that's a bit of a hard one. It can be more interesting, but it's a bit harder. So I'd say the first one is kind of like an easy, kind of like cartoonish one. You will get the Terminator world and a perfect world. The second one might be a bit more relevant to some of your work, but it's harder to do. So that's my steer. In the pack and also online is this. And so this is the grid. So choose your pair. Don't mix up the 2 pairs, because I think I've tried these out and they definitely work as set out. If you start swapping them, well, yeah, you can do anything you want, but it might take you longer. But put 1 uncertainty on the horizontal axis, put 1 uncertainty on the vertical axis, and you will then have your 4 combinations. And then the task is to start jotting down 4 scenarios. I suggest you read the 2 examples, which are also online and also in the packs. Read the 2 examples, one from the Future of Work by the RSA, the Royal Society for the Arts, and one from the European Commission on the future of fishing. And you'll get a sense of the way in which these are they're not predictions of the future. They're not academic writing. This is meant to this is a creative writing exercise, but it's a directed creative writing exercise. You could start by having just some bullet points to give you an idea about what it'd be like, and then start to go a little bit more, loosen up the creative writing bit of your brain. You don't need to do all 4 quadrants, but I definitely want you all to do 3. There's no point in just doing 1. Even 2, 3 to triangles, perfect. Okay. Okay, I think, so we're compressing quite a lot down into half an hour. So there's quite a lot that's artificial about this. I think if you do the toolkit version of this, just this bit I would suggest you set aside 2 hours for it. What I'm hoping that the toolkit's only really doing its job if you can pick it up, download it next week or the week after, and use it with your own colleagues without me in the room. So I guess my learning goal for today is that it's at least enticed you, given you enough understanding to know what it is, and entice you to try it and download it. And I'll show you there's the QR code, in fact. You can download it from Silip. So I think it does take more time than half an hour. I mean, people study this kind of stuff for years. But I think as long as it's given you, do you think has it enticed you to want to try and do this with more time?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay, I'm just going to say, did anyone online actually try this exercise? I think, Pete, you did because you asked a question, but how many people online actually tried the exercise? And can anyone type in a succinct description of how they felt doing it? Okay, and anyone else from the room then? Any other kind of reactions of how it felt doing this? Oh, go on, yeah.
What I found, and I think maybe some of the rest of the group found, is it starts to make you think. When you're in one box, you start to think about the others more. So it's in one sense, I take what Bill is saying. It's confusing, but then it's forcing you to try and achieve a bit more clarity. I think that's kind of what we were starting to encounter. It was where we were going. Yeah, it was interesting. I didn't expect that, but yeah.
When I've done this before, there is a bit of there's like an unraveling that the more people do it, the more they realize that actually, I wish I had more time to do this. And then I think then you get a bit more practiced. So we did, I talked to someone who was doing this for a national broadcaster, like the BBC, but in a different country. And he came up with 4 scenarios, and there were 4 very different ones. And one was where like everybody really values creative content from a state broadcaster, and they willingly pay their tax or their TV license and all that. And then another scenario was where it was just all going to pieces, and they didn't even know where their audiences were, and digital was challenging, and they didn't know what to do about it. And another one where kind of populist politics just absolutely kind of laid into. And I said, I bet on any given day, there's someone in the broadcaster organization with like hundreds. There's probably someone going to 4 different meetings, and each meeting takes place in a different one of those 4 realities. They probably have one where like, yeah, everyone's going to want to take part in our national celebration of blah, blah, blah. And then the next one's like, oh my goodness, we don't know what's happening. And I think that, to me, what you've just said is describing that. And I think that I think is the value, being able to see that rather than it just happening to you, but see that that is happening, gives a tiny little extra bit of agency. I'm going to leave it there because I know Claire needs to say some, someone needs to say some final words and wrap this up. But look, thank you for bearing with that and indulging me by doing my exercise. Hopefully it's whetted your appetite to have a go and do it yourselves. The point of the toolkit is you can download it and run it over one team meeting of maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours ideally. You could do the more difficult bit, which means setting up a second one 2 weeks later. Okay, anyway, thank you very much.